Far away from the heartlands of Islam, Muslims in South and Southeast Asia make up nearly 2/3 of the global Muslim population. The emergence of the religion was in the early era of Islam, but no one could have predicted the explosive effect it would have. Asia Wired looks at the seeds, the growth and the blossoming of Islam, which has defined the region as we see it today. Speaking to its experts on the Muslim heritage of this culturally rich part of the world. In this episode, we look at Indonesia, the world's most populated Muslim country with over 200 million followers. It's the world's largest island country with more than 13,000 islands, consisting of hundreds of distinct native ethnic and linguistic groups. Indonesia's national motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or unity in diversity, conveys this character. We spoke to Dr. Carool Kersten, who is senior lecturer in the study of Islam and the Muslim world at King's College London, and author of the book, A History of Islam in Indonesia, Unity in Diversity. In part 1, we looked at how the early seeds of Islam were planted in Indonesia from the 13th century onwards. This was through a peaceful process involving contact with India, China, Persia and Arabia. There were multiple points of influence, with trade routes, Islamic preachers and local rulers becoming Muslim, all important factors.
We have a very complex picture. There is no single Big Bang theory, as one of the historians specializing in this early process has once phrased it.
The very location of the country also played a huge part. In part 2, we look at the influence Islam played in the next phase in Indonesian history, the colonial period under the Dutch East Indies. How did faith in Indonesia influence resistance against the colonial masters, and what role does it now play in modern-day Indonesia? So now we move to the colonial period, which many of the Muslim nations in that region went through. The colonial period has had a significant impact on the religion. The Dutch colonialists put the whole of the region under its rule as the Dutch East Indies and were there for nearly 200, 300 years. Could you describe the events of that and then the fight for independence and eventually, of course, what we see of Indonesia today?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I suggested earlier already that the arrival of Islam predated the arrival of European colonists, which for some historians was presented as one of the explanations for the Islamization of Southeast Asia. But we have seen that predates the arrival of Europeans with a few centuries. But certainly the arrival of the Europeans and the encroachment of Portuguese and in the case of Indonesia, of course, in particular, the Dutch East India Company sort of coincided with the gradual development of what I, in my book, call the network Islam in Southeast Asia, that traffic back and forth between Indonesia and the Arab Middle East. That dynamics gets indeed a very new component when the character of European colonization in Asia changes. And that is on the back of the Industrial Revolution with the need and the desire for raw materials, but also for finding new markets for the products of European industries, makes European expansion change tact. Until then it was mainly buying or stealing, but siphoning off the riches of Southeast Asia through trade. But from the 19th century onwards, the Europeans switched to a much more invasive mode of colonization. We enter the age of high imperialism. And that has also an impact on how the Islamization process, which is still an ongoing process in Southeast Asia, not only then, but actually until the present day. But it is certainly that it changes character in the course of the 19th century. And as examples, I can put forward 3 wars that were fought at different parts of what is now Indonesia. The first conflict that erupted was in southern Sumatra, known as the Padri Wars. Later on we see uprisings in central Java, and at the end of the 19th century in particular in that Sultanate of Aceh. Now all three wars actually started out as challenges by local Muslims, often those influenced by reformists' ideas emanating from the Middle East against local power structures. So it was in first instance an indigenous conflict. In the case of Minangkabau, this is a particular ethnic group in southern Sumatra which is matrilineal in its internal kinship structures, which is sort of runs counter to the patriarchal societies we find elsewhere in the Muslim world. And Muslim reformists sort of were dissatisfied with that mode of social organizations and began to challenge it. At the back of that, there is also a competition between different Sufi orders. The Shattariya order, which was, supportive of Ibn Arabi's Wahdat al-Wujud, Sufism, and the arrival of the Naqshbandis, which were influenced by the ideas of Ahmed Sirhindi in India, which advocates a much soberer kind of Sufism, where adherence to Sharia is, for example, very important as almost a precondition for spiritual attainments. These conflicts also start to pan out and play out in southern Sumatra, but very quickly the Dutch become involved because these local rulers, who are still very much proponents of these matrilineal cultures, see actually an ally in the Dutch. So an internal intra-Muslim conflict then turns into rivalry between indigenous Muslims and external kuffar colonizers. A similar dynamic you saw evolve in the Java War of the 1820s, which is interesting for another reason, because the Java War was the last uprising against the Dutch being led by a member of the traditional Javanese aristocracy, Prince Diponegoro, who himself was indeed a descendant of the lineage of sultans of Yogyakarta, a sultanate that still exists in Indonesia, but he was himself a very pious Muslim and actually presented himself as the Ratu Adil, which is Javanese for the just king, which is very much an Islamic concept. So we see there basically an aristocrat reinventing himself as a Muslim reformist. He was defeated eventually and sent into exile, but he is still regarded, even in independent Indonesia, as a national hero. And this process repeats itself also in Aceh, although a few decades later, when the Dutch make an effort to bring this unwieldy and fiercely independent Muslim sultanate under its control. But basically, the Aceh Wars, as they became known, I always call it, this is the Dutch Vietnam, because it lasted for decades, and the Dutch were never able to bring Aceh under its control. And actually, in independent Indonesia, the central government in Jakarta also never was able to pacify Aceh completely until the 1990s, when an armistice and eventually a peace treaty was made, which has held now for over a decade, but the future remains to be seen to what extent, the Acehnese will become loyal Indonesian citizens. But so in the 19th century, we have instances of what I call Islam as resistance. And that, of course, was also the pre-stage of the role of Islam in the independence struggle, which really took off at the end of the 19th, but in particular in the early 20th century. Things gradually change in the early 20th century when we are confronted with a quite unique phenomenon, which is quite distinct and the key feature of Indonesian Islam, and that is the rise of Islamic mass organizations. Founding of the Muhammadiyah in 1912, which embraces the ideas of Muhammad Abdu. A decade later, there is the Persatuan Islam, the Islamic Union, which is much more revivalist and literalist, so closer to the ideas of the later Rashid Rida, and maybe even charmed by ideas like those expounded by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in Arabia. But even the traditionalists feel they have to respond, and in 1926 they established the Nahdlatul Ulama, the renaissance of the scholars, which is, you know, sort of the core mainstream of conservative Sunni Islam and people who say we are the heirs of the Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The interesting thing is that these organizations were founded between 1912 and 1926. That means they predate much better known organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and certainly Jamiat al-Islami in Pakistan by decades. And if we look at following, these organizations, the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama in particular, they dwarf the Jamiat al-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhoods in numbers of adherents, of followers they can claim. We're talking 40, 50 million people here. And of course, they were very smart because the Dutch did not tolerate political Islam, but they did allow the Muslim segment of the population of the Netherlands, East Indies to, you know, try to achieve emancipation through education and dawah. And that is what organizations like the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama focused on primarily. But they are sort of overtaken by events because in the Second World War, Indonesia was became part of the Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia, and the Netherlands, East Indies were occupied by the Japanese for 4 years. And the Japanese had a different attitude towards political Islam. They thought it could become a vehicle for integrating also Indonesia's Muslims in what they euphemistically called the Asian co-prosperity sphere. It basically meant a Japanese colonial empire, but in first instance, politically minded Muslims in Indonesia, then still the Netherlands, East Indies, collaborated with the Japanese because, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And then they thought they could, that the Japanese would actually not just support them in throwing off the yoke of Dutch supremacy, but also allow them to become independent. In the end, it didn't turn out that well, and after the Allied forces had defeated the Japanese, there was a brief power vacuum, and in Indonesia that was used to declare independence.
Proklamasi kami bangsa Indonesia dengan ini menyatakan kemerdekaan Indonesia. Hal-hal yang mengenai pemindahan kekuasaan dan lain-lain diselenggarakan dengan cara saksama dan dalam tempo yang sesingkat-singkatnya. Jakarta, 17 Agustus 1945, atas nama bangsa Indonesia, Soekarno, Hatta.
What followed was a vicious war because the Dutch refused to recognize it, but it also created a momentary sense of tension among the independence fighters in Indonesia between the secular nationalists led by Indonesia's first president Soekarno and political activists who were now united in the first Islamic party in Indonesia called Masyumi, which was actually a party that had been founded by the Japanese, but it survived World War II and it became a sort of an umbrella organization for Muslim political activists of Muhammadiyah backgrounds, Nahdlatul Ulama backgrounds, and a whole plethora of smaller organizations. But Masyumi made a failed attempt to get some kind of a reference to the Sharia in the Indonesian constitution. Although Indonesia was a Muslim majority country with between 80 and 90% of the population at least nominally Muslim, because of the multi-ethnic and multi-religious composite of the population, declaring Indonesia outright as an Islamic state, like what happened with Pakistan a few years later, was considered too risky, and even a reference to Sharia law in the constitution was considered too dangerous, too explosive in a country like Indonesia with, you know, very sizable Christian minorities as well, in particular in the eastern islands of the archipelago. So you see that Indonesia becomes, by then indeed, the largest nation state, Muslim nation state in the world, but it keeps Islam at arm's length of politics. Masyumi is sort of frustrated by this, but in particular mass organizations like the earlier mentioned Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama sort of adjust and survive until the present day. Masyumi is part of several post-war cabinets, and even its leader Mohammed Nasir briefly even serves as prime minister, but eventually, because of the increasingly authoritarian tendencies of founding President Sukarno, Masyumi is banned, but Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama are allowed to continue to operate because they are not outright political parties. And you see, for example, that the office of Minister of Religion in Indonesia, which is a very important office in the land, because I have to explain here that when Indonesia keeps Islam at arm's length of the constitution and the political structures, it does not mean banning religion or Islam from the public sphere. It's all about control. And here there is an interesting parallel with Turkey, where Ataturk had done similar things, abolished the caliphate, changing dress codes, you know, even dropping Arabic script, like Indonesia did as well. They adopted Latin script for writing, which are vast cultural changes and giving a signal that Islam is a sort of put on the back burner, but always with the intention of controlling it, not banning it. And both Turkey and Indonesia have massive ministries of religious affairs to do exactly that, bring religion under state control. And that key office of Minister of Religion was usually given alternately to senior officials of the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama. And that continued not only during the years of Sukarno, but also in the 1960s after a military coup d'etat, when there were suspicions that Sukarno would side with the communist bloc, and which has led to huge massacres in Indonesia in 1965 and 66 of alleged communists, many of them ethnic Chinese, so there is a very nasty racial dimension coming in, and unfortunately youth militias of the large Muslim mass organization play quite a sinister role in this development. And in the military-dominated regime that takes over in 66, which is known as New Order regime and which was dominated for 30 years by President Suharto, there was a different attitude towards Islam. Suharto also never allowed, for example, the re-establishment of the Masyumi party, and for many years he gave what I call mixed signals to the Muslim community. He was accommodating and willing to work with Muslims who saw indeed a role for Muslim professionals in what became the key urgent point of New Order policy, and that was economic recovery. Indonesia's economy had suffered terribly during the autocratic years of Sukarno, so the military regime wanted first and foremost to jumpstart the economy. And there were loyalist Muslim activists who saw a constructive role for Muslims in that, and they were co-opted by the regime and allowed to partake. And in return, there was, for example, a huge expansion, state-sponsored, of the Islamic education sector. So you have the interesting phenomenon of a country that doesn't mention Islam in the constitution, that doesn't want the reference to Sharia, building up a massive network of what they call state Islamic universities. It sounds like a contradiction in terms. But this system also, especially since New Order, has actually flourished and thrived. And I think it has also been instrumental to the next big change, which sort of inaugurates the phase Indonesia is in now in 1998, when basically people got fed up from Suharto. We had a regime change, and it has put Indonesia on now a 17, 18-year-old track of experimenting with democratization, which, if we look elsewhere in the Muslim world, is quite successful. Not only was Suharto replaced in first instance by the leader of the Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest traditional Muslim organization as the first freely elected president of Indonesia. But the leader of the Muhammadiyah, the modernist Muslim organization, became speaker of the Consultative Council. So here in 1998 you have the leaders of the two biggest Muslim mass organizations, one traditional, one modernist, holding the highest offices in the land and basically shepherding Indonesia into a democratization process which has gone now through 4 cycles of fair and free national elections. There is also a sobering note to be added. It has taken Indonesia indeed 16, 17 years to demonstrate that a democratic system of governance is there to stay. But the very fact that there is an opening up of the public sphere has also posed challenges and puts the robustness of that democratization to the test. And in particular in 2005 we have what I call a watershed year, which was a sort of the make or break point of the democratizations that had started 7 years earlier. I understand from experts on democratization that after about 7-8 years a democratization process goes from its transition phase into its consolidation phase. And there was a real challenge in Indonesia when you saw around 2005 a growing polarization. Because of the openness, you also have to tolerate voices you don't like. That's the price you pay for democratization, and which basically also is the testing point for how robust is our democratization. And there was a real tension between reactionary Muslims who sort of, wanted to use the opportunity to Islamize Indonesian society further. They were supported by conservative ulama who issued fatwas that were against ideas like secularization, religious pluralism, liberalism as they called it. And that tension, has not completely evaporated. But the most recent development we have seen is actually an assertiveness and a sort of a refound self-confidence, in particular in the Muslim, the progressive Muslim bloc, both within the Muhammadiyah and in the Nahdlatul Ulama, where also towards the wider Muslim world they start to present Indonesian Islam, and I hope to have sketched indeed that there is such a thing as an Indonesian Islam, has actually some things to teach to the rest of the Muslim world. And maybe in particular on the back of the disastrous outcome of the Arab Spring, there are some sobering lessons that it takes time to democratize Muslim societies, which in many instances unfortunately have had to cope with decades of autocratic regimes, that these changes don't take place in 2, 5 or even 10 years. It takes a generation. And Indonesia has demonstrated that even under the most advantageous circumstances, because in Indonesia it has not been interrupted over the last 17, 18 years, it's still an uphill battle, but maybe also an optimistic lesson for the wider Muslim world.
Thank you, Dr. Carool Kersten,
Pleasure.
for joining us on Asia Wide on Islam Channel. It's a pleasure.